In this playlist, we'll look at the structure in structured collection of statements, talk about how it is that arguments are structured, and how it is that that structure helps them to fulfill their function of modeling inferences. So we'll begin by looking at the division in statements between premises and conclusion and the relationship of an inferential claim that is implicitly or explicitly asserted to hold between the premises and the conclusion. Then we'll spell out explicitly how it is that that structure allows arguments to fulfill their role as models of inferences. So our argument is divided into two classes or groups of statements. On the one hand, we have the premises, and these correspond to claimed evidence. On the other hand, we have the conclusion. And the conclusion is what is claimed to follow from our evidence. The premises are related to the conclusion, sometimes explicitly, but always at least implicitly, by an inferential claim. An inferential claim makes a statement about the relationship between the premises and the conclusion under a certain condition. Specifically, it says, if the premises are true, when the premises are true, then the conclusion is either highly probable in the case of an inductive inference or necessarily true in the case of a deductive inference. So inferential claims relate premises to conclusion under that specific condition that may or may not hold. The claim is always asserted regardless of whether or not the premises are true. It always is implicit in the argument. If my premises are true, then my conclusion has the following status. Now, when we think back to the inferences lectures, we'll recall that we had this giant class of statements that are highly probable given what a particular cognitive agent might know. And within that class, there's this smaller class of things that are definitely true given what a particular agent knows. So then we have the set of things that are explicit and available to the reasoner, to the cognitive agent, for the purposes of making an inference, and that's the smallest of those three classes. A deductive inference then takes that initial information that is explicit and available to whatever part of the brain is making that inference, and it transforms that information, taking that explicit and available information and rendering new explicit and available information, transforming that old information into new explicit information, never going beyond what's guaranteed to be true given what the reasoner originally knew. In the case of an inductive inference, the reasoner has that set of explicit and available information. A psychological process transforms that information, taking that information and then rendering explicit and available a set of highly probable statements, such that if that initial information is true, it transforms that information and then reveals some new information that is now explicitly and available to the reasoner that is highly probable, so long as the inductive inference is good. Deductive inferences, they trade power for truth. They never go beyond what's guaranteed to be true given that initial information, and for that reason they're said to be non-amplitive. Inductive inferences, they leverage some feature of the world to go beyond what's guaranteed to be true, but not so far that they start to fall off the likelihood map. Instead, they just try to travel to this other area, this area of things that are very likely to be true, given that initial information, so that once that transformation is complete, the new information is likely to be true, given what they knew, but it's not guaranteed. So inductive inferences trade a little bit of that guarantee of truth in order to get extra inferential power, and for that reason, they are said to be amplitive inferences. Inferences, as we've seen, are psychological processes that dynamically relate initial information to information that they act to transform in either a deductive relationship or an inductive relationship. But how is it that collections of statements can model this dynamic psychological process? Well, let's look again at our two classes of, this time, statements. Highly probable statements, given what the reasoner accepts as true, and guaranteed truths, given what the reasoner accepts as true. The reasoner, again, has a set of statements that they accept as true for the purposes of the argument. Those are the premises. The conclusion in a deductive argument is also within that circle of things that have to be true, statements that are going to be true given the truth of the premises, given the truth of what the reasoner already knows. And they're related to each other by this deductive inferential claim, by this claim that asserts if these premises are true, then the conclusion also falls within this circle. The conclusion also is a statement that has to be true. And so that relationship between these static statements, the premise statements that are collected together, and the conclusion statement, that relationship expressed by the inferential claim mirrors the relationship in the information transformation in our deductive inference. And the same will hold true for our inductive inference. Again, we have a set of statements that are given as premises in the argument. If the reasoner accepts these premises as true, the argument makes the claim that the conclusion will be highly probable given the truth of those initial statements. So again, it takes a set of statements that the reasoner is accepting as true, the premises, and it's relating them to another statement, the conclusion, by making this claim about their relationship. Namely, if those premises are true, then the conclusion is one of the statements in that class of highly probable statements, given what the reasoner has accepted as true. So again, the relationship asserted between premises and conclusions in this static model mirrors the relationship in the dynamic psychological process of information transformation that is an inductive inference. Let's end this lecture module by quickly recapping and making explicit those relationships between the elements of inferences and the elements of arguments. The structure of arguments is what allows them to function as artifacts generated by their creators to model potential inferences to potential consumers of those arguments in a comprehensible, rigorous, and normative format. And this format will likewise facilitate the refinement and evaluation of inferences as so modeled. This is all accomplished because there is a one-to-one correspondence between the elements of inferences and the elements of arguments so that their structures are replicated one to the other. In our inference, initial represented information is the beginning of that process. In our argument, it's statements that comprise the premises of that argument so that they correspond in a one-to-one way with the initial represented information in that dynamic psychological process. With inferences, that initial represented information then gets transformed by that dynamic psychological process. Arguments, of course, are static collections of statements, but they have a structure. The premises are grouped together and they're related to the conclusion by an inferential claim. And that inferential claim asserts the same two kinds of relationships between initial information and resulting information that we see in our dynamic psychological process, that is, our inference. Finally, the inference generates a new set of represented information that's either highly likely given the initial information or guaranteed to be true given that initial information. in our static model of that inference, the element that corresponds to that is the conclusion statement, so that each element of our inferences has a corresponding element serving the same general functional role in our arguments. And that is why our arguments can serve as models of potential inferences that we can present to other people, we can use to persuade them, we can use to refine or evaluate potential inferences, and so on.